In this slideshow, we're going to talk through some different terms that are going to be useful for narrative analysis. And again, we're going to use a comparison between theatrical film and television because that's really useful to come up with different forms of comparison to think about how these different media forms tell stories and what it is that television does that's different. So, the first structure, if we think about the traditional theatrical film, that is movies that you go and see in a movie theater, you have a single protagonist. The protagonist is the central character of the film, the central character that the film is about. The main characteristic of a protagonist is that they have an objective. That is, they have something that they're trying to achieve. It doesn't matter if they're a good person or a bad person. The protagonist has an objective. They have something they're trying to achieve. In a film, you have to have lots of exposition. Exposition means the information that the audience needs to know in order to understand what's going on. In a film, you have a lot of it because people are coming to something that they don't know anything about yet. So usually you spend about the first 20 minutes of a film just establishing characters and setting and giving us a sense of what the film is going to be about. In the theatrical film, you have motivation of the plot based on that character and their objective. That's what motivates scene after scene in a series of events, is that protagonists having some objective that they're trying to achieve. They're trying actively to get something. You have in film what we'll call a narrative enigma. That is a central question that structures the narrative that we expect to find out in one way or another by the end of the film what the story is. So that usually has to do, again, with the protagonist and their objective. Will they be able to achieve this? Will they fail at this thing they're trying to do? There's one central question, and that's what we call the narrative enigma. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's some mysterious thing that we don't know about or we don't understand. It's just that question that the film is going to resolve. And by resolving it, solves the narrative enigma, brings the story to a close. In film, we have a clear cause and effect chain. That is, if we see something happen in one scene, we expect it's going to have an effect on what we see after that. There's natural linkages between what happens. There's not extraneous action or information. We expect that there's going to be a cause and effect from one scene to the next. So all these things here, these are typical characteristics of how films have evolved over 100 years to tell stories. They're not all like this, but this is the standard model. Okay, in film we have a climax. That is the point where the narrative conflict culminates. The difficulty that the protagonist is having in achieving what they want comes to this high point, the climax. And in the climax, we're going to know after that whether or not they got their objective, whether or not there's going to be a sense of closure. That is a resolution. And the vast majority in times in film, there is resolution. It doesn't necessarily mean it's happy or sad. It just means that we now know the answer. That narrative enigma is solved. We know whether or not they got that objective. There is a sense of closure by the end of the film. Our relationship with the story world is brought to an end. Now, if we contrast that with television, in the episodic series, we have usually not just one protagonist, but multiple protagonists. And so remember, the way that we define protagonist is that it's a character that has an objective. It's something that they're trying to achieve. So in an episodic series, you may have several different characters that have enough depth to them that we understand what they want or what they're trying to get. This doesn't mean there isn't a single person that may be the central character. It just means that there's multiple characters that have identifiable objectives. They have things that they're trying to get. In the episodic series, we have exposition, but far less. Why? Because we don't need it. The story is established in its first episode, and after that, we just need to know what's happening in this particular episode. We don't have to be explained everything every episode. So that's one of the advantages to the episodic series. So what motivates an episode is there's some disturbance to what we call the narrative equilibrium. The narrative equilibrium is the overall sense of where we exist at the beginning of the episode, that things are the way they usually are. And then something happens. Somebody comes into the episode that we're not used to, or some event takes place that changes things. Something happens to disturb that initial equilibrium that we have. And then by the end of that episode, we're going to return to that equilibrium, hopefully. So rather than having a narrative enigma like film does, TV episodic series have what we call a narrative problematic. This is an important term. It's a little bit difficult to get a hold of, so I want to talk about it here for a second. But the narrative problematic is an ongoing dilemma that frames a series, that is essentially what that series is about. And if that thing were ever to be resolved, the series would kind of fall apart, right? So the narrative enigma might be, if we take a series, an episodic series like Friends. The narrative problematic is you have a group of close friends. They're single at the start of it. They're not really successful. They're struggling with growing up, becoming professionals and adults in New York. And the ongoing dilemma is essentially, how do they maintain friendship, and how do they get by in a day-to-day routine, being that they're not all already successful or already have families. Instead, they're forming their own family. And if any of them were all of a sudden to become rich, or if any of them are to move away, or as the series ended, we know they get married and move away, well, then the series ends. Okay. Another way to think about this is the narrative problematic of Orange is the New Black, which we'll see a couple of episodes, or at least one episode of. The narrative problematic in this series, which is episodic and also has serial components, is that you have this woman who does not seem to fit into prison, but she goes to prison. And essentially what's called a fish out of water story. If she gets out, or if she fully adapts, then the series is very different, right? Another classic example would be to think about, maybe you've heard of the show The Beverly Hillbillies. They are hillbillies who live in Beverly Hills. They don't fit there. Why are they there? They got rich. Right? And their ongoing dilemma is trying to fit in this place that they don't fit in. And if they ever cease to be rich, they'd have to leave. Or if they ever fit in, then all the conflict would be gone. It wouldn't be funny anymore. So the narrative problematic is that ongoing dilemma, and that is more important than having a single enigma the way film has that film will resolve. Okay, we have a cause and effect chain like we do in film. That is, we expect when we see something happens in the scene that it's going to have an effect on what we see after that. But additionally, there are more segments in television because of commercials. It's commercially segmented. And those segments tend to structure the series in some interesting ways. Okay, we have climax in an episode, but it's for a particular episode and what is happened to disturb that equilibrium, like I said. And we can't have complete resolution because that would mean the end of the series. So individual episodes may have a little climax. We expect that. But then the ongoing dilemma, the narrative problematic, that cannot resolve. So we talked about the film. We talked about the episodic series. Then we have the TV serial. Okay, so what is a serial? A serial, the key difference is that the storylines continue from one episode to the next. And you, again, in TV series, you tend to have multiple protagonists, even more protagonists. In terms of exposition, you have stories continuing over and over again, and things don't end. So you tend to start right in the middle of the action. You don't have some kind of establishing information just for that particular episode because our storylines are always continuing. You do get a kind of exposition that's typical in the serial and less common in episodic, and that is there's redundant information. In other words, information is repeated. People will talk about things. Characters will recount what's going on to help bring people up to speed, to help new viewers or viewers who maybe missed an episode come up to speed with what's going on. What motivates what happens in a serial has to do with desires of characters that often in cases have been established long ago in the past, and they just continue to be issues and continue to carry throughout the series. In the serial, we have narrative enigmas. We have lots and lots and lots of narrative enigmas. But that's because all these individual stories are going to continue episode to episode. Some are going to end, but there's always got to be some more to continue. Okay? So narrative enigmas are important in serials because they tend to have so many different stories. And although some can be solved, there always has to be something else to pick up the slack. So in the serial, traditionally, serials aired during the day. They were daytime TV. They were soap opera. Those programming that's on at that time has more commercials in it, so they were more interrupted. They have climaxes, but it isn't at the same time of a particular episode. It isn't to a particular episode. It's to those individual storylines that have to do with different characters. So you have lots of these different little climaxes related to different characters, but it's not for a whole episode or for a whole overall story. So with the serial, when it comes to resolution, really overall there's a sense of never any resolution. There's so many stories, so many different narrative enigmas that we are used to the idea that we're not going to have closure. Things are not going to be resolved. Just if the one question we have, one enigma might be resolved, but there's 1,000 more that are waiting to pick up the slack. So you think about here, again, we've said that today in today's television, dramas especially really blend episodic and serial. These are some of the characteristics that they blend.